people look at it and they're like, oh, well, the time it takes to do a podcast is a lot. The money it takes to edit the podcast is a lot. But what are you getting out of it? You're building up really great relationships. You're networking with so many people, and you can't put a monetary value on that.
Most hosts never achieve the results they hoped for. They're falling short on listenership and monetization, meaning their message isn't being heard and their show ends up costing them money. This podcast was created to help you grow your listenership and make money while you're at it. Get ready to take notes. Here's your host, Adam Adams.
Welcome back to the podcast on podcasting. I'm your host, Adam A. Adams. Well, hello. We interrupt episode number 117 to shout out one of our listeners. And that listener, and I might be saying the name wrong or pronouncing it wrong, and by that, I automatically apologize. It is Donetta Giaconek B85C. It is a very cool name. I think it's Donetta Giacone, but I could certainly be inaccurate. So I'm just going to pretend like it's Donetta Giacone 85C. I want to just thank you for taking the time to leave an honest review and let you know that once you do that, you're automatically added into a raffle. Like we're literally drawing names for free services. So you could win either like a free editing. I think it's like for 6 months. I'll have to double check. You can win free editing like of your podcast. So you literally do nothing except for record the podcast and we do all the rest. You could do marketing where we guarantee that you get in top 10%, or you could win a launch. Like if you don't have a podcast yet, we will do like our full launch package where we literally guarantee you get in the top percentages of all podcasts. We handle all the artwork for you. We make it so easy to start a podcast. And like it's a pretty penny to pay for the top package, but you might actually win. So let's just call you Don. That'll be easier. High energy and great content. And then Don says, this is great. Love Adam's energy and vibes. This show is highly recommended. So we will make sure that that review is in the show notes. And Mr. or Mrs. Don, when you hear this, I want you to just email me, my team at growyourshow.com. And just let us know that this was, episode 117, what your name is, and we will add you to actually win some free shit, some good shit, the good shit. All right. With that said, I don't want to interrupt the episode too much because I know that the episode also has a ton of value. So let's jump right in. And today I'm joined with a friend, somebody that I've known for quite a while, Aileen Prak. Her husband, Salen, started a podcast quite a while back. It's called How Did They Do It? Real Estate. It's a real estate investing podcast. And I remember when they reached out to me and said that they wanted me to be a guest on the show. I was incredibly honored and I was like, yes, I want to do it. I must have been one of your first, like close to it, right?
Yep. And actually, your episode ended up spanning 3 episodes on our podcast because you provided so much great value on that we had to break it into 3 episodes.
That is so funny. I appreciate that. You know, it's funny. Like when I tried to add value or whatever, when I try to answer questions, I'm always like trying to think like, how does this matter to the person listening? And so sometimes I think that I go into just so much detail to make sure that the tangible takeaways are there. And so this is definitely the first time that it's been turned into 3 episodes, but it wouldn't be the first time that somebody said, I usually go 20 minutes and then we take like 45 minutes or whatever. So I think that's interesting. It's a blessing and a curse. Aileen, I want to talk about like going back to How Did They Do It and your podcast. There is so many questions in my mind that I think the listener wants to know. And if you don't mind me starting here and just share what you feel comfortable with, I started a podcast with other people. I would say I'm grateful none of them were married to me because honestly, it didn't end up working out with them as co-hosts. And it was especially challenging for me to make that change. with 2 co-partners. And so something that I'm always thinking about is most people that want to start a podcast, they think to themselves, I want to start a podcast, but I don't want to do it myself. Either because I'm not fully confident in myself, by being by myself, or because I'm not sure I could sustain if it was just me. I might do 3 episodes and drop off. But if I have an accountability partner with me, it'll help. I can see so many people who are thinking about starting a podcast might decide, I want a partner so that it solves these problems. You not only started a podcast with a co-host, but you're also married to the co-host. So I want to know pros and cons for you, what we should be thinking of before we launch a podcast with a co-host.
Yeah. So exactly to your point, when we first started the podcast, me and my husband were thinking to ourselves, well, we wanted to create the thought leadership platform, but how are we going to do it? And of course, when you do it, when you go into something new together with a partner, things just seem so much better because you're able to share in your nervousness, you're able to share in the experiences, and you're just able to spread that a little bit more when you have a partner. And so that's why we decided to do it together first, because both of us are very, I would say when we first started, even now still, we're very introverted people. We never put ourselves out there before. So starting the podcast was a huge challenge for us. And so having to talk about ourselves and everything like that. So having someone there, especially your spouse, made it so much easier because we could brainstorm together, at all times of the day, we had access to each other. We could brainstorm how we wanted to structure the podcast. And then we could go in and we would take turns asking questions to our guests. And then we try to make it as smooth as possible because you didn't want to start interviewing the guests with your co-host and stepping on each other's toes and then mess up the flow of the podcast. So we would kind of structure it where he would take the first couple of questions and then I would take the couple of seconds, and we kind of play around to see where each person best fit within the podcast interviews. So there was a lot of coordination between the two of us when we were first getting started.
And out of curiosity, because at least in my case, there was 3 of us and one kind of fell off and rarely joined the podcast. And then the other one kind of fell off and rarely joined the podcast. And in my case, I'm constantly saying, and I felt so weird about it, to be honest. I'm constantly saying on my show, and I sold this show a while back, but welcome back to the blah, blah, blah podcast. These other 2 couldn't make it today. And I just felt like a broken record, always being their faces are on the front. It says all of our names, but they're rarely on. I've known a lot of people that have started podcasts with a co-partner, and then one of the people kind of fall off either because they have a full-time job, they just don't have as much passion. Where was that with you guys, to the extent that you're willing to share? Because I'm hoping that it's somehow beneficial to somebody who's about to start a podcast, potentially with someone else.
Yes. So we had to have that conversation. So just like you were saying, at first we did every single episode together because we were co-hosts, Selah and Aileen. And so we made it a priority to do every single podcast episode together. But I think after we talked to some people, we talked to some of our mentors, and then they're like, well, why are you doing it always together? You don't have to do every single podcast episode together, because now the time that you're spent together as a co-host on the podcast, you're taking away from other aspects of your business where their time is better utilized. And so we're like, oh, that makes sense. And so we didn't really fully embrace that until a little bit later on, but we tried a little bit where I would start taking a couple of podcast guests and interviewing on an episode by myself. And then Selah would do a couple on his own. And then we kind of realized oh, it makes sense, because then now when we each have those extra times to focus on something else, the time that we're spent on the podcast, our times are better utilized that way when we're able to divide and conquer. And so then later on, when we got to a couple more episodes, we really had to have a hard conversation, because one of us was definitely enjoying it a lot more than the other person. And Selah liked meeting with all the people. He liked doing the podcast guest interviews and everything like that, but it just wasn't where he was most passionate about, where his time was the most valuable. And so when we really had that conversation, he was like, Aileen, I think this is something that you seem to be more passionate about, something where you're good at this. You're better at this than he was, at least from his words. And so he's like, I think that you should really focus on the podcast and then I will do other aspects instead. And so when we really had that conversation, we had to have that really open, honest conversation with each other. Then it made a lot more sense where now I focus more on it. And then he'll come on once in a while, but at the same time, we were really able to divide and conquer and really put our time to where we both enjoy what we're doing and making the best use of it.
Yeah, so much good stuff. And I think that's really helpful for the rest of us as we're starting. Your story isn't unique. I know nobody likes to hear that. Well, I'm unique. But what I'm saying is lots of people have started podcasts and basically had one of the teammates, one of the co-hosts, end up falling off after a little while. So that has definitely happened before. And I'd love to be able to identify that and see through that for you and for the listener for sure. I really want to bring up another thing that's is certainly unique about you. And that's the amount of episodes that you have published. Your podcast has been around for a little while, but you just have tons of episodes and on two parts. Number one, why do you do that many episodes? Because it's like 5 a week, I think, right?
Yep.
So why 5 a week? And with that said, is it challenging to do that many per week? Is it easy? Does it benefit your business? So why did you determine that that's what you were going to do? And how does it feel making it continue to happen?
Yeah. So when we were trying to determine when we were first starting out the podcast, how many episodes should we be producing per week, right? Should we do a daily podcast? Should we do a weekly podcast? But when it came down to it, we looked at all the people and then not a lot of people produce 5 episodes. But most of them are either weekly or they're monthly because it takes up a lot of time. And so for us, we really wanted to challenge ourselves and take a look at all those people that we admire. And we're like, well, what do they have in common? Well, they do a daily podcast. And so we're like, okay, those are the types of people that we want to aspire to become. We want to follow in their footsteps. And so for us, that's how we decided to go into releasing the 5 episodes per day because it is a lot of hard work. And for us, it's like, we need to challenge ourselves a little bit because if we want to be successful, we have to push ourselves a little bit harder than other people. What differentiates ourselves from other people? We're up for the challenge because we like to push ourselves a little bit more, get outside of our comfort zones. And so we're like, well, if we're going to do a podcast anyway, let's just go all in and just produce as many as we can. We're networking 5 times as many people than if we're just doing. And so that's why we decided to do it.
That is such an interesting thing. So 2 major takeaways that I got. Number 1, you're networking with 5 times the amount of people. Before I go to the other takeaway that I really got there, why is that important? What are you getting from networking with 5 times the amount of people, like publishing 20 episodes a month instead of 4?
Yeah. So it's building up the relationships. And so one of the things that you think about when you first start the podcast is we're just putting out episodes, we're meeting some people, but after you're starting that podcasting, you don't realize the level of networking that you're gaining. And I feel with the podcast, you're able to kind of establish a little bit like a deeper relationship with the people that you're interviewing, your guests and everything like that. And so being able to network with 5 times more people, that's how big your network is going to grow. And so through this, we've met so many people just like yourself that we've really connected with, that we've wanted to partner with, that we have partnered with on some of our deals and everything like that. We've built really great connections with these people, and we wouldn't have been able to do that if we didn't do the 5 times a week.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And the other thing that I wanted to mention is how you started the podcast and asked yourself prior to starting a podcast, what is similar to all of the people that we look up to, admire, and respect in this space? Like, what podcasts are there out there that we like? And you notice something is they all did like a daily show. And I think that that's such a huge, impactful thing for our listener right now, who's also a podcaster, to really extract and spend a moment on. And that's the fact, if you don't mind, Aileen, if I share a quick story, I have a friend who actually bought the podcast from me. His name's Jason. And Jason shared with me a long time ago this gas station example. It's the strangest thing. Basically says, if you go somewhere and if you're driving down the road and you see a gas station, the person who owns that gas station, if they're like the only one on that corner, they might barely making it financially, like barely paying their bills. The strangest thing is, Jason said with this gas station example, if somebody comes in next to them, let's just say the person is like making $3,000 a month, $30,000 a year, barely making payments with their gas station. When somebody moves in across the street from them, it doesn't go down to 15 and 15. It's not that there was only 30,000 available for the year and that we now have to split it between two people. It works differently. When you post more episodes, when you have more content available, strangely enough, all of your episodes do better. Instead of like the people that say, I don't want a daily episode because I don't want to give too much value. I don't want to run out of things to say. I don't want my listener to be stressed out that they're getting pinged every day with content. But it works oppositely. Like if you have 4 gas stations on one corner, all of the gas stations make way more money. Like now everyone is making $500,000 a year. It's the weirdest thing, but because now everybody recognizes that corner as a place where they're supposed to stop. So it doesn't matter what direction, they're always going to stop there. So I've noticed that we get more listenership too because of that. And it goes to show, Aileen, the people that you admired and respected and heard of, they were the ones doing more content. So to the listener, yes, it's more work, but there are some benefits. You're networking with 5 times the amount of people. You are more likely to get more downloads per episode, even though it doesn't make sense to us. Think of the gas station. Aileen, you also decided in the very beginning, I don't know why, because it just sounds nuts. No offense. You decided that you would be like editing your own show. And I'm sure you learned a ton. I edited a lot of my own show, but I wasn't doing 5 a week. We started out doing like basically 1 a week. But if you don't mind sharing like the pros and cons of maybe editing your own, because in full disclosure, my team edits. How do they do it? Like we are the team that edits all 5. So I'll just mention that up front. But the question would be, Aileen, why did you switch over? Like, why did you start doing it? Why did you decide to start switching over and hiring somebody else? I think that'll be beneficial to a listener who's like either considering one way or another. So help us understand which way is better. I know that was a very long-winded question. Basically just say, should we edit our own? But go ahead.
So when we first started it, we had that conversation. We're like, oh, let's just do everything on our own. Let's just edit the podcast. When we say we, I really mean Selah, because I'm not very tech savvy at all. So he really had to figure out, how are we going to host this thing? What kind of equipment do we need to use? What kind of systems are we going to record on and everything like that? And so really he had to learn everything. And it was a lot of studying on his end. And it took, I think per episode, it took at least like 3, depending on the episode, 3 to 5 hours per episode for him to edit it, especially in the beginning when you're still learning it. You're still trying to figure out what sounds good, what doesn't sound good. He's playing with all the different like options and everything like that. And I think he edited almost like close to 100 episodes on his own before we decided to switch over. And we were doing 5 days a week, and it was taking so much of his time that he started to not like the process at all. And so we had that conversation. We had to sit down and we really had to have a hard conversation, because if he didn't like editing it and he was our editor, the podcast would not be able to sustain itself. I could do my podcast episodes, but then I don't have anywhere I would have to try to figure it on my own then. We wouldn't be able to post it. So it would just be sitting there and it wouldn't go anywhere. So it wouldn't be sustainable. That was the first thing. And when you're getting into the podcasting, you want to make sure that it's sustainable. So I wanted to do this for a long term, not just a short term type of thing. And so I'm like, well, if you're really not enjoying this, then we should outsource it. We need to find somebody to help us with this who's better at it than we are, who can do it much faster, because really our time is valuable. And are we the best people to do it? No. There are so many other great resources out there. And so when we had that conversation, he's like, yeah, that makes sense. And you really have to make that determination, because where is your time most valuable? It's not editing the podcasting. There's other people who are so much better at it, who are going to help you be so much stronger as a team. So why not do it? You're able to grow faster. You're able to spend other time where your time is much more valuable doing other things.
Yeah. And with Selah, for example, well, two things that need to be said. Number one, we're not technically faster than Selah. It's like 16 hours per episode versus 4. But if we just use that 4, Selah was working like around 20-ish hours a week on editing these 5 episodes a week, right?
Yep. And we have our full-time jobs. And so we were getting up to the very wire almost all the time, like releasing episodes, because we would be scrambling the night before. We're like, okay, we have to get this out. And so he would be working really, really late into the night, just trying to finish an episode so we can post it, and that we wouldn't miss a day.
Yeah. So interesting. So we don't just charge a tiny bit of money for our services, right? Like it's around $150 an episode. Well, you guys are doing more. I think the price might come down for you, but the point would be, if I'm a listener and I want to start a podcast, I want to have a podcast, how do I know if spending like around $150, $175 per episode makes sense for me? Like, where do we determine if it's money well spent?
First of all, you need to look at how much is your time worth, right? If you're spending the $150 per episode, but if you break it down by hour, how much time you yourself are spending on editing the podcast on your own, it's not that much for how much time like you and your team are putting into each episode. And so when you're calculating, you're like, well, if my cost per hour, outsource this to somebody else who can do it better for this cost, my time is spent doing other things that I could grow bigger. I can focus more on the other side of the business and eventually the rewards later on. But it's really changing that mindset, because what is your time worth? And so where is your time better spent is the real question.
I had another person on the podcast, Aileen, that was also for a while editing their own show. And we actually found that one of the activities that they did, they would make like $30,000 an hour on. It was closing on new deals and getting an acquisition fee for a syndication. But the point is, this guy figured out that he was making like $30,000 an hour on some of the things that he could do. If that's the case for you guys, if it's $30,000 per hour, or if it's even like $500 an hour, the 4 hours spent on each episode, or the 20 hours spent per month or per week for some people on their podcast, that could actually cost us tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars, depending on, like you said, you started it out by, it depends on how you value your time. Love that.
Yep.
Let's talk about this. You have a full-time job. Your spouse has a full-time job. You are doing a second type of work as well, like a side hustle almost, or you started that way with real estate investing. You're doing syndication and other things like this. But you also have a marriage. You also have a couple of children. And you still decided to do not just, let alone a podcast, but a daily podcast. Can you share any benefit that you've gotten from all of this work and effort, doing so many things at the same time, raising your children, keeping your relationship intact, which any of us who are married know that that's always a struggle, keeping your full-time job, your husband keeping his full-time job, but you also doing like a daily podcast? Is it ultimately worth it? Are there any pros and cons that the listener needs to know before they do something like this?
Yes. So it all goes back again to looking at the people who you want to emulate, who you want to follow in their footsteps, because they say success leaves clues. And the people that we admire, the people that we see are being successful in the area, they're doing a daily podcast. They also have families and they also have kids. Well, some of them working still, or at the time working W-2 jobs too, and they were still able to do it as well. And so we look at ourselves and we're like, well, if they can do it and if they can step up to the challenge, we can do the same thing. Because if we want to follow in their footsteps, then we really should be able to step up and make those sacrifices that we needed to in order to make this work and make this happen. So it's really getting clarity on where you want to spend your time. And that's something that we really had to be cautious about too. So we were waking up really early in the mornings to do podcast recordings, where in the evenings we were like podcast recordings. And then one thing that really helped us a lot too was every other Fridays I get off of work and I would just batch record interviews one after the other so that I have enough interviews. So people look at it and they're like, oh, well, the time it takes to do a podcast is a lot. The money it takes to edit the podcast is a lot. But what are you getting out of it? You're building up really great relationships. You're networking with so many people. And that in itself is, you can't put a monetary value on that. And so for us, even though the time that we spend on the podcast and the money that we spend on it, you can't compare with what we've gotten out of it so far. We've grown in ourselves. We've met so many people. We've gotten such a huge education from all the wonderful guests that we've gotten. And we were able to and had the privilege of interviewing. And we were meeting such great people that you wouldn't necessarily have the opportunity to meet unless you were doing a podcast or something like this, or had some type of platform to be able to invite them onto it. So the value that we've gotten so far, you can't even measure it.
Yeah. So I totally get that. And I, that way as well with this show and my last show, like the value that you get is really hard to put a monetary like dollar amount on. What would you say is, if you were to express gratitude for your podcast, which I guess I can't say that you will or won't, but let's just pretend like if you could express gratitude, what would it be about? Would it be about the networking that you've made? Would it be about something that you've learned? Would it be about the connections? If you could only like pick one thing that you know that you got because you had a podcast, might have been nearly impossible without one, what would that be?
I think it was through our conversations with people, and like what we've learned is having that mindset shift and having this open and abundant mindset that we probably wouldn't have gotten without this podcast, because we talked to so many people, and the more value that they've offered, the more that they've been able to receive as well. And so for us, gaining that clarity and gaining that mindset shift on wanting to share as much value as we can, we've just seen it happen time and time over again with all the guests that we've had on the space. And that has been like the biggest thing I think that we've gotten.
Yeah. Cool. Nowadays, how often are you on the show? How often is Selah on the show?
I would say I'm pretty much 100% exclusively on the show now. And then Selah's focus on something entirely different in business.
I really am curious about this, like sincerely, and I think the listener might be as well. Does the podcast's cover art or title or intro or outro say that there's two hosts? And because maybe you haven't changed it since? And if so, is that something that you're planning on changing? Is there a reason to change it? Or are you just glad that it says both? I'm curious all the way around.
Yeah. So this is something that Selah brought up, actually. I hadn't really thought about it. And he said, you're really the one focusing on the podcast. So you really should be like the face of the podcast. You should be really the point of contact for it. We hadn't really talked about like changing all the cover art and changing all that stuff. But he has mentioned that like you should be really the one just focusing on the podcast because you're doing all the interviews and everything like that. So it would make sense.
Got it. Well, Aileen, if you ever need anything, since we work together, we'll do like voiceover artists for you for free if you ever need that, or we'll redo the cover art for your podcast if you ever want us to give you some ideas. There would never be a charge. So just so you know, like if you do that, let us know and we're happy to throw out some ideas or cover the cost of some of that stuff. So it just makes it easier. But at any rate, let's jump into here because I really want to understand like what did you learn most? Oh, no, that would be a better question for Selah, because he did most of the editing. Did he ever say like something that he did in the editing that he was like, I totally learned this thing? Is that something where you would know that answer, or should I just ask him in particular?
I mean, I can guess. I can give you what he mentioned
Yeah.
before that he learned was when he listened to audio, like after he did the podcast and he started listening to other podcasts, and he would notice like these little things like sounds or like drops or something that he wasn't aware of before until after he started doing the editing on our podcast. Because all these little things, he's like, oh, when people like touch the desk, like you can hear that. And so now when I do other things, like, oh, I try to be cognizant of that and aware of it as well, because I never picked up on it until he mentioned it. Because he's like, I hear all these little things now. So yeah, he's just more aware of it.
Yeah, I totally get that. And I pick up on it now a lot, like the desk drumming. I actually was just having a podcast interview right before you and I got on this one, because I do all of mine on Wednesday. I know you batch a lot on Friday, but the same thing. The guy was a podcaster. He's been doing podcasts for a long time, but he does not edit his own show. And he kept tapping his desk and it was so loud. And I'm like, dude, can you cut it out?
It's hard to edit those out.
It is. It certainly is. That is really, really good. I noticed when I edited my own that I have a ton of filler words. For example, I would say, okay, so every time I wanted to transition from one thing to another, I would say, okay, so let's talk about this other thing. And when I was editing my own and noticing that I always said that, I stopped saying it. Or I would say like a lot more than, I don't think that I say like ever. I never say like, or at least I think so. Until I edit my own, then I say, whoa, this is driving me crazy. Why do I say that so much? Okay, so, like, I didn't realize how often I said it until I edited my own. And I think it helped me to be a better speaker by doing less of it, because I now have to be more conscious. So there's a lot that we learn by editing our own, and just don't think that everybody needs to. But I think if you do, you'll probably learn something. So we talked about the most valuable. Let's talk about the biggest challenge you've ever had, like the absolute hardest thing you've ever dealt with since having a podcast. What would that be?
I think the hardest thing was actually just getting started with the podcast. It's funny because we had talked about, I had brought up the idea to Selah well before we started the podcast. And I said, I think it's a great idea to do a podcast, but we never actually took the steps to actually get it started with. It was always just an idea. And I'd be like, oh, this would be a good idea to put it into the podcast. But getting past that mindset and actually just getting started with it was the biggest hurdle, because there were so many things holding us back from it. And then when we actually got past it and we thought to ourselves, well, we don't want to regret not ever trying, because what's the worst thing that could happen is we just stop the podcast. But if we never actually took the effort and we never took the actions to actually do it, like later on, we're going to look back and we're like, oh, I wish I just did it, because I can always stop anytime. That's the worst thing. But if I never actually do it, I would always have that regret. I would always like think it back, like what happened if I did this? And I think that that's the worst thing.
Yeah. Thank you. That's hitting hard. I'm really glad that you mentioned that. So the hardest thing really was starting it, but you overcame it because you knew that you had to start it. Outside of all of that, is there a mistake that you made along the way that maybe you could pour into our listener and say, don't make this mistake? I did. Is there anything like that?
I would say maybe not a mistake, but a lesson learned was we were doing podcast interviews. Like in the beginning, we were trying to accommodate a lot of the guest times and everything like that. So every day we would be finding and filling up spots wherever we could to be able to interview, like do our guest interviews. But what we found to be the most effective was batch interviewing and just doing it all in one day and having those consistent, like back-to-back interviews, because you're already in that mindset. And then it's just like talking one after the other. And so it's a long day, but at the same time, I feel like you get so much more fulfillment out of it by putting it all in one day than if you were just doing it every single day, like at all random hours.
I definitely feel like for me, I do batching as well. I record. We're only publishing a couple episodes a week right now, or at least as we record this, I found out that we have 40-ish extra episodes ready to go. And so I may or may not be telling my team to just go ahead and publish a lot more. But the batching has been beneficial to me. And I've heard it from all sorts of different people. There's pros and cons on the batching. And it's interesting. Some people say, I can only do one at a time. I can only do two at a time. I can only do three. My max is 4. And then I hear others, like we've got a mutual friend, I think, Aileen, named Whitney Sewell, who created another real estate podcast. He had a full-time job for a long time, and he would batch. And it was like he would do somewhere between 8 and 12 episodes every Saturday, or almost every Saturday, so that he could regularly publish daily episodes and always be ahead of the game. Now, personally, I don't know if I could ever do more than 8. I start to be burned out at like 6. So I'm really curious where you are, Aileen, because like I said, this end of the spectrum, I just do 12 at a time. There's this other spectrum, I can only do 1 or 2 or 3. So you mentioned that it's beneficial to batch, but do you feel like you've got a limit there?
Yeah, I know too, like in between, sometimes you start to get worn out after a couple. I think the most I've done was like 10 interviews in the day.
Wow.
And yeah, it takes a lot out of you at the same time. But then one of the things that kind of keeps you going is getting hydrated, having like a little break in between, and just like having a little breather, like step outside of the room for a little bit, like in between your interviews. But yeah, I mean, like you have to kind of know yourself too and what's your limit, because if you're getting to a point where you're not enjoying it anymore, then what's the point? Like do what's comfortable for you, whether or not be batching or maybe doing batching 4 interviews and then doing every other day or whatever like that, whatever it is. But I mean, just personal preference and just listen to what your body needs.
Maybe Whitney's one of those guys, because I know he does a daily. But who else was inspiring you in your field? Was there another person that had like a daily-ish podcast?
Yeah, absolutely. 100%. Whitney Sewell was one of the top people that we're looking for, that we've modeled ourselves after, just where he's coming from, the message that he provides, just who he is as a person. Definitely somebody that we admire very highly and think very highly of. The other person you know as well as Joe Fairless. He has the longest standing daily real estate podcast episode, and he's seen such massive success. Yeah. And where he comes from also is someone that we highly respect in the space as well, not only in the space, but as a person and as a friend as well. So those are the 2 people that we really aspire to be like.
I'm going to ask a question specific to Joe. I was hoping that you might mention him. Great podcast. These 2 guys are just great people. Joe had been doing, and I haven't heard his show in a couple of years, I think. He had been doing something called Follow Along Friday. Have you heard of that, Aileen? Follow Along Friday?
No, I've heard of the Situation Saturdays.
Okay, yeah. So he's got Situation Saturdays. He's got something on his Sunday, but he also had a Follow Along Friday where him and a co-host don't interview other people. They only talk about their own business. So out of a whole week, there is 7 episodes that publish, but one of them is always specific to like Joe's own business. And I love that. I think if we have like a coaching program, if we are selling anything on our own, if we are looking to attract private money, passive capital investors, if we're trying to do business ourselves with our listener, it comes down to that. We should probably be pouring into the listener. And I've went on this podcast, all of my even numbers are supposed to be by myself. So that's like every other. So if I do 2 episodes in a week, one's just me for a few minutes, and the other one is an interview. I bring this up to ask you, how many are you doing that are interview? How many are you doing solo? Do you have any intention of pivoting that anytime soon? And why do you do it that way? So I know that's a lot of questions, but it's really, what do you do, interview, solo, and why?
Yeah. So our podcast is 100% interview based. So I haven't done any solo episodes myself. And I think that's just a limiting belief that I have of myself and just the mindset block that I'm nervous about doing an actual like solo interview or a solo episode for myself. So that's just a personal preference right now. And then it's just, we've been in the habit of just doing interview based. So that's kind of where we're at right now.
Yeah. I don't know if you'll take this thought, but I bet you I have a strong impression because I know you as a person and I know Sayla as a person. You're just like amazing humans. And I imagine that it would help your listener know you better, trust you more, want to be part of your world more, be more likely to share your episodes. Maybe if you took one a month or one a week where you just, hey, Sayla, let's do one where we just talk about where we are, what we're struggling with, what we're doing, what we're gaining, any advice. Like Joe, for example, he was not really like preachy. He wasn't really like pouring into the listener specific, like, hey, you need to do this, you need to do this. It's just like, hey, this is what we're struggling with. And it brought people along. Me, I'm different. At least with this show, I try to pour into the listener and be the expert in a thing. And either way, I think it's going to be beneficial. And I think that your listener will probably love hearing you. And that translates probably to others. Be conscious of, am I doing solo? Am I doing interview? Am I doing a combo? What are we getting out of it? What is our listener getting out of it? Because it can definitely make some differences. Aileen, I want you to, speaking of your co-host, your husband, I want you to think for a moment, what is the best advice, speaking of Joe Fairless too, best advice ever. What is the best advice ever that you could give to somebody who's thinking about starting a podcast, might want to start a podcast, either that they don't know where to start, or if they're good enough, worthy enough to start a show? What do you think would be your top pieces of advice that you'd give to somebody like that?
Yeah, I think one of the things is if you are nervous about starting a podcast because you feel like you don't have anything to share or you're not an expert in the field, go ahead and start it anyway, because you can do interview-based type of podcasts. You can bring on experts to talk to whatever subject that you like to talk about or whatever. But the thing is just getting started with it and getting past that. And just always, something that I took actually from your interview and that I always try to incorporate now because it was so impactful for me is always thinking about your audience and what brings the most value to them, and always keeping that in the forefront, I think has helped build and strengthen the conversations that I've had with my guests as well, always keeping like the listeners in mind. But yeah, getting started with the podcast, just really focus on getting started. Don't have those limiting beliefs about yourselves that you're not the expert in the space or I don't have enough time. It's how you apply yourself and just taking up that challenge, because you never want to go back to it and think like, oh, I should have just tried this or I could have done this, because you'll never know unless you actually take those steps.
I have to be completely honest, Aileen. There was just so much amazing value that you just dropped there. I loved it. And honestly, it's like a mic drop. I got the chills and everything, and we could simply end there. I did, although, have one final question. If you're listening, by the way, if you're a listener today and you're loving this podcast, feel free to give us a rating and review. Let us know what you think. Any questions that you have. I do look at all those ratings and reviews independently, and I always appreciate it. So feel free to do that. One thing that I think Aileen can help us with that not everybody could ever say is helping us find a way to get those guests. And I just know so many people that even like our clients that have worked with us, that one of their top concerns is, how do I get a good guest? How do I find a guest? How do I get somebody to agree to being on my show? And with you, Aileen, you've done something like 200 episodes, give or take. And for the most part, those are separate people. You did 10 interviews in one flipping day. That sounds crazy. How do you get good guests? Like, what advice would you have to somebody, whether they want a daily or a weekly podcast, how to find good guests, what pitch to share, what to say, how to get people to say yes? What have you done that's helped you?
This was one of the biggest questions that we had for ourselves also when we first got started, because we weren't experts in the space. We didn't have a track record. We didn't have any footprint at all. And so the biggest question was like, well, why would any guest want to come on our show? And why would they want to talk to us? Right. And so we had to get over that mindset shift as well, because I think one of the biggest advice that somebody gave me was, you have a platform and you're giving an opportunity for somebody to share themselves. And so if you think at it from that point, you're also providing value to your guests as well for being able to share their story, to helping them get their name out, share their story with other people as well. So if you think it from the guest's standpoint, you want to provide an opportunity to them as well to be able to come on and share their story and do what you can as well, so you can help promote them. And so you'd be very surprised with reaching out to people on getting guests, how open and willing they are to wanting to share their story. If you're coming from an open and honest and genuine place and wanting to spread their word and share their stories as well, we were very surprised about like the guests that we were able to get onto their show and how willing they were able to come on. But we wouldn't have known that if we didn't do the outreach. We didn't send an email. And then from there, we were able to ask them like, hey, if you enjoyed the show, we would love to help share other people's story as well. So if you know of other people that might be interested as well, please help introduce us or something like that. And they would also help to introduce us to somebody who might be interested in being a guest on our show as well. So that's how we've been able to do it, is through referrals.
A lot of good value. A couple of the takeaways that I got from you on getting good guests is, number one, it's what's in it for me. You understand that you've got some value, that you're giving people an opportunity. You're providing them a place to share their story, share their feedback, to get exposure. And as you're reaching out to people, you're genuinely thinking about how can I help them? And as they can get the answer quickly to what's in it for me, they understand, then that's the first thing, is that you're sharing it for them. The second thing that I got is that basically a quote came to mind: you miss 100% of the shots that you don't take. If you never ask that girl out or that guy out, you're probably never going to go out. You're probably never going to get married. You miss 100% of the shots that you don't take. And just like starting your podcast, pushing through and just getting it done, you're able to at least get some traction. But what you found was the third takeaway that I got is that most people, when they know that they can get value from it and they know that you're coming from a genuine place, most people quickly and easily want to add value and get their story out and share on podcasts. So you haven't really gotten a lot of no's. But again, you would have never known that if you didn't ask. So a lot of good takeaways that I think that we can get from this entire episode for sure. Getting introductions was the fourth takeaway. You maybe have somebody on your podcast, or you know somebody who knows somebody. Hey, can you put me in touch with this person? Or can you put me in touch with anybody who did this? I will use a fifth one that maybe you didn't really say. Sometimes we can specifically just ask, because I know I've done this and others have done this with me. They've said like, hey, Adam, who have you had on your show that I could have on mine? And I've listened to, for example, Joe's or Whitney's podcast. And then I've said, hey, I liked this one episode that you did with this one person. Is there any way you could make a warm intro? And so I've gotten introduced that way as well. So, man, so much value. I appreciate it. There's so many takeaways that we got. I appreciate the abundant mindset that you shared with us, like when you're interviewing other people, like where you're adding value to other people, when you're doing these things for the right reason. And you've also talked about how through your podcast, you've partnered with some of the people, like you've done deals with, it sounds like, some of the people that have been on your show. And having a podcast, it sounds like, at least in your position, there's so much value that we get out of doing it that there's really no reason not to have one. Would you agree?
Yep, I would absolutely agree with that.
Love it. The name of the podcast, the link to the podcast, the name of the website, the link to the website, all of these things, if you're listening and you want to connect with Aileen, that's all in the show notes. Just scroll down. You'll see her bio there. You'll see a resource section, and you'll see like how to contact her. That's all in the show notes. Just scroll down right now connect with her. And if you do listen to the podcast, how did they do it? Whether it's the episode that I was on or the 3 episodes, whether it was that or anything else, feel free to give her an honest rating and review as well of what you thought of that show. We've gone overtime. I've only done that a few times. I appreciate you, Aileen, for sticking around past when I thought we would be done with the episode. But I just got so much value from you, and I really hope that the listener did as well. So I'll let you go. Thank you. And they've got everything that they need to contact you.
Awesome. Thanks so much again, Adam.
Bye for now. This episode is brought to you by GrowYourShow.com. Grow Your Show lets you be the star of your show while we handle all the hard stuff. We offer reliable and affordable post-production services that allow you to grow your show organically without all the work. So go ahead and check out the website right now and feel free to schedule a call with me and let's take your show to the next level. Again, GrowYourShow.com. You just press record. We handle the rest.